Dear Professor Bovenac, it's nice to have you with us for this interview today. Uh, we recently published an own book, an own manifest itself regarding philosophy and politics. One of the philosophers who we got our inspiration from was the difficult philosopher Martin Heidegger. It is difficult comprehending for a lot of people if they start reading Heidegger. That's why we wanted to do this interview to clarify some questions we had from our readers. So, Mr. Bonavec, I'm just going to have to ask you the first question. That is, in the modern society, Heidegger stated there's a feeling of alienation. What did Heidegger mean by this?
Yeah, Heidegger's concept of alienation is something that he sees um, as really inherent to human existence. And in that respect, it's very different from the kind of alienation that you encounter in writers like Rousseau or Marx, because there, what alienates you is some kind of social structure that is either unjust or does not allow you to be who you are. And so it's something that's coming from the outside. And so changes in external conditions might change this. In Heidegger, that's not the conception at all. Instead, I have to try to understand who I am. And as soon as I begin doing that, I realize that I am not in control of a huge amount of my life. Um, I am thrown into the world. That's one of his fundamental concepts, this idea of thrownness. I'm tossed into the world in a way that I didn't have anything to do with. I'm born at a certain place in a certain time. I've got certain family members who are part of my environment from the beginning. And a huge amount of that is just not under my control. Later, of course, I can exert more control by actualizing various possibilities that I have, but the range of possibilities that I face is largely not up to me. It's given in part by my own circumstances and my own abilities and dispositions, but to a large extent, it's just given by the place and time where I'm born. And so he sees us as inevitably going through a process of alienation, thinking, wait a minute, this life was just kind of given to me. It's not one I chose. And it's not just a question of living or not living, to be or not to be. It's a matter of all sorts of details of our lives are just given to us. And we have to act within the bounds of that horizon that's pretty limited. So inevitably, I face alienation. And then the question is what I do about it. But I think that confrontation with the Da of Dasein, that hey, I am being in the world, but I'm being here in the world, and to a large extent, the here wasn't up to me. Now, what where I start, of course, isn't up to me. Then I can move and I can do something with that. But but basically, I have to forge an identity for myself, given and accepting the fact that a huge amount of it is not going to be under my control.
Okay, if we would translate it to one of the topics actually today in a lot of debates, someone who has difficulty with their own sexual identity, their own biological gender, etc. Is this a kind of struggle people have with their own thrownness in the world?
I I think it is actually. That's an aspect of thrownness that I think Heidegger wasn't thinking about, but it is a perfectly legitimate consideration to think. Wait a minute, it's not just my place and time. It's all sorts of features. It is my sexuality, but it's also my height, my health status, and lots of things like that are just given to me. Disability theorists have thought about this kind of question too, because in some ways they face a circumstance where that they're thrown into, either by circumstances of birth or later as a result of an accident or something of this kind. And so people inevitably face a certain process of alienation, like, wait, I didn't choose this. Why am I like this? And you can feel this sense of separation between aspects of your being that are just given to you and then ones that you would have chosen if it were up to you. And you can start thinking, wait, I don't like what I was given. I want to do or be something else. So yeah, I think this fits very naturally into Heidegger's framework.
Okay, thank you for your answer. A second question. Our Western society today is looked up as very strongly individualistic, especially the liberal side. How does Heidegger's view on authenticity differ from modern concept of individualism? Sorry.
That's a good question. Uh, I think we have to think about what we have to do to overcome this sense of alienation in Heidegger. Um, and his reaction to it is really different from that of existentialists later in the tradition, like Camus, for example, who talks about my revolt, my freedom, my passion. For Heidegger, I have to become authentic and overcome my alienation by affirming my being. And that's going to include contingent features of my being that are just given to me. So I have to embrace my being in the world in the way that I am. Um, and and here's a place where lots of theorists, including the sexuality theorists you were mentioning, would not be too happy with his answer. But he's raising, I think, a really interesting question. If I go through at least this stage of alienation, how do I overcome it? I might revolt against it and simply declare my own radical individuality as the existentialists do. I might say, no, it's a matter of affirming what has been given to me, and claiming what is given to me and what I'm thrown into as mine. And I think that's more his answer. But you could also have an answer in between that says, I need to think seriously about which aspects of what I've been thrown into I embrace and which ones I want to move away from. And so when we think about the existentialist views in contrast with Heidegger, they seem to be at two extreme ends of a scale. My own view is that maybe that's unfair to both because I don't see either extreme as entirely plausible. I don't think becoming an individual means declaring your radical individuality so completely that you reject everything that was part of what was given to you. On the other hand, I don't think that simply embracing it all is the right answer either. Almost everybody, I think, feels that there are certain aspects of their culture, their existence, their time and place, and so on, that they would like to change. I don't live where I was born, for example. And so I think uh, Heidegger's point might be put in a somewhat more plausible way by saying, I don't have to embrace everything, but I do have to come to some understanding of myself and some conception of myself as an individual in light of the heritage that I've been given. We are self interpreting animals, and we interpret ourselves against a background, against a framework of concepts that are given by our culture and that are to some extent given by the time and place where we're born and the culture at that stage. So I don't think we have to interpret it by saying, I have to accept everything. But maybe I do have to do the framing I do, the thinking about what I want to embrace and what I want to reject in terms of the conceptual framework that my culture has given me. So, in short, individuality for him is always individuality within a certain context, within a certain background, or given a certain heritage. And that's a little less extreme than a lot of modern conceptions of individuality, not just the existentialists. I have to frame what I think of myself, my own concept of who I am, but in terms of things that are already there available to me. So, if I can use Thomas Nagel's terms, I have to do this using the point of view from here, not this abstract point of view from nowhere. Sometimes with modern conceptions of individuality, you get this sense that somehow I rise above all of this, all of the things in my background, and I simply choose an identity that I would ideally like to have. Heidegger doesn't think it works that way. I start from here, and I don't have to stay here exactly, but I do have to frame the self that I construct as I grow and engage with the world by using the kinds of terms, the kinds of understanding of what a human can be that my heritage has given me. So it's always an identity framed from here, even if it doesn't have to embrace every aspect of the here.
Thank you for your clear answer on this topic. Now, another question. Heidegger's claim was that the Western philosophy had reached its logical end of metaphysics that started with the Platonic tradition. What did he mean with the philosophical rebirth that was necessary?
Yeah, this is a hard question because it in part gets us into later Heidegger and the reflections in his book Contributions to Philosophy, um, which is long. He wrote it over a period of many years, showing it only to a few friends. It was published 13 years after his death, and it's a bit rambling. Um, but but nevertheless, I think it's an intriguing book. So let me see if I can summarize some key thoughts in a way that will respond. As I see it, in Being in Time, which he wrote relatively early, he's looking for the ground of the possibility of not just being a self, but being in a world with other people. And he says, in the end, this has to do with the disclosure of being in time. In fact, the very last line of the book is the preliminary disclosure of being, though it's unconceptual, makes it possible for Dasein, as existing being in the world, to be related to beings, to those it encounters in the world, as well as to itself as existing. And so we've got this, to some extent, primitive notion of being in the world, but he's asking, how is it possible for us to be with other people? And the answer has to be, he thinks, the disclosure of ourselves and everything in the world in time. But that's the ending. Contribution starts there. And as I see it, what he's doing is applying Kant's strategy of asking transcendental questions again and again. So, okay, we have the disclosure of being in time. What are the necessary conditions for the possibility of that? What is its ground, to put it another way? And then he starts thinking not just about Dasein itself, um, and Dasein as a dynamic process, but he's thinking, what are the grounds of the possibility of a dynamic process at all? And he thinks to analyze that, we need to go back to Greek philosophy and start over. He thinks the Western tradition has more or less made it impossible to answer this question because it misconstrued what the Greek philosophers were really after. And he sees this as the question that was really motivating them. When Aristotle talks about metaphysics as the science of being qua being, I think that's the kind of thing that Heidegger says we have to reinterpret that and go back and think, what would it be to have a science of being qua being? It would be to ask, what are the necessary conditions for the very possibility of being, or at least being in the way that we experience it in the world? And what's interesting, I think, about Heidegger's way of taking this is that he puts, you might say, the pragmatic element first, as opposed to the epistemic element, just as he does in Being in Time. The primary way we interact with the world, he says, is not a matter of perceiving it and knowing it, as most Western philosophers have thought. Instead, it's um, seeing it as for something. And so seeing things as pragmatically useful to us. So go back to Greek philosophy with that understanding, thinking the basic way of encountering the world is not just perceiving it, but instead employing it, using it, interpreting it, and owning it is a translation that people have introduced for ereignis, this German term that he uses. It's something like appropriation. And it can mean two things. It can mean appropriating something in a more ordinary sense, taking something, but he says it also can, he also means by it taking something to be something, taking an object as a particular thing. I could look at a ball, for example, as a toy, or as something to be used in playing a game, or simply as a sphere. And when I'm thinking about that, I'm interpreting it. I'm taking it as something. So this sort of active interpretation, he says, is something that we use all the time in encountering the world, and it's a primary way of encountering the world. But now, what are the necessary conditions for the possibility of that, of acquisition in this sense, of appropriation, of taking something to be something? And and here he says, just as I can only become an individual against the background of a heritage, of a culture, I can also only interpret something in terms of a network of meanings that I already got. Um, if they aren't linguistic meanings, they're at least concepts that are there. There are social practices that are interrelated, and I interpret this in the context of some practice, in the context of some other concepts. So I don't do this ex nihilo, as it were. I am always doing it against a certain background. I relate to a structure of meanings, and in that way interpret something by putting it into the structure, relating it to that structure. Um, now, I, I don't want to be I don't want to overdo this because I don't have to have a complete structure of meaning in order to do this. In fact, I think the model of interpretation he has here is something like putting pieces of a puzzle together. Um, yes, I do look at the individual pieces, but as pieces that I'm doing something with, and I don't have to have a picture of the entire puzzle, but I do have to have other pieces around. If I've just got one puzzle piece, I can't do anything with that. I can't interpret that. I interpret it by relating it to other puzzle pieces. Doesn't mean I have to know what the overall puzzle looks like, but what I do is start relating it to some other pieces, and then I build the structure. And eventually, understanding becomes having enough of the structure that I see how the various parts interrelate, and I actually have some sense of what this is a picture of. I think that's a sort of model. So I have to have a few other pieces at least to relate things to make sense of anything. Now, this is a very different conception of what being and being in the world is from the one you get in traditional Western philosophy that starts from Plato and Aristotle or even the pre Socratics and thinks in terms of perceiving and then knowing and believing on the basis of that. And then acting comes far down the road, and interpreting comes down the road. Instead, for Heidegger, interpreting and acting are essentially tied together, and that's where we start. So, from his point of view, we have to go back to the very foundations of Western philosophy and rebuild on this sort of, if I can put it that way, that pragmatic and sort of holistic sense that I I have to act within a certain context. I have to frame meanings in a certain context. And we start there. And then out of that, eventually, we can build these epistemological notions. We can talk about what it is to perceive something, what it is to know something. But we start with what it is to take something to be something in order to use it. And then all of those things come later. So, from his point of view, the Greeks were asking exactly the right questions, but then they and everybody since went off in the wrong direction, taking the wrong things as fundamental.
So, a question that I got from one of our readers who asked me yesterday: what is the concept of um, of experience or of our everyday experience in Heidegger, because he thinks it's more important than, for instance, empiricists or other philosophers.
That's right. Once you see that you have to rethink things from the ground up, of course, at some point you're going to want to talk about experience, you want to talk about perception and knowledge, and so on. And so all of that has to come into the picture at some point. And unfortunately, as I see it at least, in contributions, he's so interested in pushing further, constantly asking the transcendental question, looking for the ground of the ground of the ground, and so on, that he doesn't pay as much attention as I would have wished to where we build and how we eventually reconstruct some notion of experience. Um, but it does seem to me we have a few hints, because if we start from the point of view of appropriating things and taking them to be things for us, then we recognize that to interpret something and to interpret ourselves in that context too, uh, even to get to the I think I am of Descartes and so on, we have to think, okay, I am interacting with the world and I am taking things to be certain things. I'm taking this to be a ball. I'm taking this maybe to be a tool. And in doing all of that, I recognize that in some sense, I'm doing that against a framework of meanings or in a context of action. And so things come with a kind of meaning built into them as a result of the context I find them in or I place them in. Well, how then do we get any conception of ordinary experience? From his point of view, it's not a passive thing. In fact, the big mistake that people have made with throughout the Western tradition really is in thinking of experience as passive, thinking of this as something that happens to me. And from his point of view, it's not like that. I am engaging with the world and I am constantly, in fact, just think about the trivial fact that we are constantly looking around. I am changing my perspective on the world on the basis of what I want to do. So it's not as if I'm just a moviegoer staring at a screen and I'm passive and everything's being shown to me. I'm acting in the world and I'm perceiving the world in ways that uh, presuppose a certain interpretation and a certain set of goals that I have. So it's pragmatic through and through. In the end, I think the picture of experience that emerges from this Heideggerian conception is something he doesn't fully elaborate, but does get elaborated more in thinkers in the pragmatist tradition, people like Charles Sanders Peirce or John Dewey. I think they are trying to develop a conception of experience that is built on something like a Heideggerian foundation. And if we think of things that way, we realize it's not that it's left out of the picture. It's just that there are several things that are really rock bottom in understanding it. One is it is active, it is not a passive thing. Secondly, I experience the world in light of some self understanding and in light of taking a certain situation to be something, certain objects within it to be things, and in light of the goals that I have, and in light of um, the usefulness of these things for me. And so one way of getting a grasp on this is to imagine the differences between someone looking at my incredibly messy office behind me. I would like to say it's only because it's the very end of a semester that it looks like this, but it actually kind of always looks like this. Uh, but there are three ways of looking at this. One is my way, where I'm looking, let's say, around for something, and it's because I need it for something. I'm looking for a book, let's say, and so it's a very directed experience of the office. Then you might have an interior decorator who comes in and looks at it, is horrified, but is looking at it from a very different point of view. You could have imagine this is a crime scene where a detective comes in and is looking for clues. They're all perceiving the office. We all might be looking around and from a traditional point of view, having exactly the same sensory experiences as we do it. But from Heidegger's point of view, those are three really different experiences of the office because we're looking around for different purposes and for different things, and our eyes are going to fix on different things. I'm looking for that book, and I remember that it was blue. So I'm looking around for a blue book. The interior decorator is going to be looking around, trying to find ways of obscuring the mess and organizing and making it look better. And the detective is going to be looking for clues. We all may be seeing the same thing, but our interpretation, what we take to be what, is radically different. And so, from his point of view, those would be three very different experiences of the office, even if in some sense, what is being visually represented to us is exactly the same.
Thank you for this answer. I have one last question myself. Is the later Heidegger with, for instance, his multipolar Daseins useful in understanding other cultural traditions as well?
That's a really interesting question. I think one way of looking at this, and to some extent, answering this for Heidegger gets us onto scary ground because at one point he begins reflecting about what it is for there to be a philosophy of a people as opposed to just an individual philosopher, let's say. And he asks this question: how does a people become a people? Does a people become only that which it is? If so, then what is it? How can we know what a people is, or what this or that people is, what we ourselves are? And we've already seen a kind of answer to this, at least a partial answer from an individual point of view. I have to interpret myself and define my own individuality in light of my heritage, in light of the things that are given to me, part of what I'm thrown into, and also then part of what I choose and create for myself in being in the world. And I'm doing that because I'm doing that within a certain culture and a certain heritage. My individuality is tied up with that in certain ways. So my my individuality developed against that background would be very different from that of an ancient Roman, let's say. Very different place, different time, different culture. Their individuality is going to be defined in terms of different concepts and a different heritage. The same thing would be true of somebody growing up in rural India, even today. Very different set of cultural backgrounds, different heritage. They will define themselves differently. So we can ask the question: is Dasein, is this being in the world something that is the same for all of us, or is it different? In being in time, I think even though the identities would be different, Heidegger assumes that the problems that arise from being in the world are identical. Um, People like Alexander Dugin have doubted that and have thought, maybe not. Maybe really there are different Daseins, that Dasein itself is relative to this heritage, this background. I think the way that Heidegger begins to think about this, and here I've got to say, in some of the works that comprise what scholars of Heidegger call the turn, I think he goes in some very dangerous directions, directions that he recognizes later are dangerous. It leads him to National Socialism, for example. He talks about an ethnic principle, struggle between various nations and cultures, between various peoples, the necessity of a people defining itself through a leader, and a variety of things that I think are a very bad idea. However, if we remove the if we take that period out and think, what does he say about this later? He says, in a sense, what we have to do in thinking about the unfolding of being in ourselves and in other people who define themselves in terms of other backgrounds. He says we have to display an utter recklessness. We take a leap. And what does that mean? Well, we really do have to just choose what set of background assumptions, what set of concepts we are going to have in a modern world where we can actually be aware of other cultures. We're aware that there are different heritages, different traditions, different sets of concepts that we could use in understanding ourselves and in defining a certain community that we want to have. And at some point, I think he doubts the possibility of really making rational choices about this. We just leap either by embracing the culture we were given, which was his earlier recommendation, or maybe leaping into another one. And people who migrate from one country, even one continent to another, are doing that. They're uh, in the earlier tradition, he would say, look, A, don't do it, and B, um, maintain your own heritage. Later, I think he says, well, if you do that, you can do that, but it's to take a leap. It's to jump into the unknown, and it's not the kind of thing you can really do rationally. Now, so partly, I think he does give us some tools for understanding the modern multipolar world in an interesting way. We can look at these other traditions as alternative frameworks for defining who we are. And they are, in some ways, he recognizes, incompatible. He sees them as inevitably being at strife with one another. I hope we don't have to interpret that in literal terms as being at war with one another, but he does recognize there are conflicts. There's a real choice here. Um, I think there's a popular idea, at least in the United States, that one can rise above this and pick and choose. And, oh, well, I like this aspect of Indian culture. And yes, I do yoga, but I'm also, yeah, blah, blah. You can combine these in any sort of way you want. I think he's suspicious of that. I think he thinks that, no, these different sets of concepts, these different traditions, really are incompatible in some ways. Maybe you can frame your own culture by picking and choosing, but overall, he thinks at some points you've got to just make choices of the background against which you're going to define yourself, your own individuality, your own life, and that isn't something you can always rationally justify. In a sense, you're choosing the framework within which you will construct your rational justifications. And that choice of a framework can't itself be done sort of from a God's eye point of view. In fact, at one point near the end, he says, maybe only a God can save us. And I think what he has in mind there is the possibility that, yeah, there is no real way of answering the kinds of questions he wants to answer in rational terms. Maybe in the end, we are driven to say, look, if we keep asking for the necessary grounds for the possibility of this and then the necessary grounds for the possibility of that, we run out of room. There's nothing more to say. And similarly here, we have to define rational choices against a certain set of concepts and that define what rationality is and even allow us to interpret what our choices are. And that framework itself can't be rationally chosen. If we try it, we're kind of caught in one of these infinite regress problems. Well, what is the rational framework within which we choose the rational framework? And he starts realizing in the end, we just have to jump. So I think it is useful for understanding. I wish I could say it points us to a marvelous way where we all hold hands together and sing, I'd like to buy the world a Coke or something. It's not like that. He recognizes that different cultures have different and to some extent incompatible heritages. They're essential to the progress of those cultures, but we they aren't easily reconcilable. We live in a multipolar world, and to some extent, we simply have to embrace a culture as our own. And that is not something that can be fully justified. So that helps us understand, even if not to solve the kinds of problems we face in such a world.
Okay, thank you very much for your answer. Is then isn't it the problem that we in the West um, took have taken our own culture and our own understanding of concepts to be universal at a certain point. Certainly after shortly after the Cold War, with the end of history, we thought, yeah, well, the rest of the world will embrace the liberal democracy and will embrace capitalism. We even pushed that even today in Eastern Europe and the Middle East, and we see that other cultures are actually revolting against those concepts.
Yes, yes, absolutely. And in fact, I think there are two ways of thinking about this that are complementary. One is exactly what you've said, that to some extent it's natural for every one of these cultures to take itself as universal, to think that it is understanding the proper way of being in the world. Um, it has been other factors that have enabled Western culture to actually be as powerful as it is and to impose itself on so many other cultures. Um, I, so I'm not sure there's anything distinctive about Western culture in this respect. Maybe there is. It certainly does have a pretense to universality that not every culture does. So, in that respect, perhaps it especially has lent itself to that kind of, let's just call it, imperialist tendency. Um, and and yes, from Heidegger's point of view, that kind of pretense to universality is itself a problem. Uh, but there's another complementary aspect to this, which which I find serious and think that when you look at our various leaders in the West, they have a really insufficient appreciation of this. When we think about not just the features of our culture, the ones that relate to our economic system, our governmental system, our whole conceptual system, uh, there is also this question of what defines rationality itself. We tend to think that even if there are aspects of the culture that are unique to us, that nevertheless our conception of rationality is universal. And that, I think, our decision makers and really the ordinary person in the culture tends to assume, oh yeah, there's just such a thing as rationality. And maybe in the final analysis there is. But this is where Heidegger says, wait a minute. To think that's the case and to think that you've got a handle on it given your heritage, that's a leap that is utterly ungrounded. You have no right to assume that. And so, even if it's inevitable to some extent, you just choose a framework of rationality. You shouldn't assume that everybody else chooses the same framework. And I see decision makers in the United States, at the very least, constantly making that mistake. They'll recognize, oh, yes, of course, there are differences between our culture and Middle Eastern cultures, let's say, or Far Eastern cultures, but they assume that their conceptions of rationality are exactly the same. And so the same kinds of considerations that would move someone in the West will move people in those other areas of the world. And that's not the case at all. I mean, one minor example of this, I think a lot of the decision making makers in positions of power in the West don't think of religion any longer as a significant motivating force. They assume that everybody's really motivated by economic concerns or various other pragmatic concerns and so on. And in many parts of the world, that's just not true. So there is a conception of rationality that is utterly secular, for example, in the West, that they assume the rest of the world shares. It's not so. But that's just one aspect of this. There are many, many aspects of our understanding of rationality itself that are not universal. And so there is, you might say, the first level question of details of the culture that insists upon its universality and all too often does try to impose itself, quite often rather successfully for economic reasons, on other parts of the world. But there's also that assumption that everybody else is going to make decisions on the basis of the same factors that we make decisions on. And that higher level assumption of universality is, if anything, I think more dangerous. If you if you assume everybody is going to like McDonald's French fries, you're going to find out quickly enough oh, in this culture that doesn't sell, people don't like it. But if you go in assuming, oh, they share my conception of rationality, it's it's much harder to get quick feedback on your mistake. And so people persist in that mistake for far longer. And because it's so pervasive, it affects many, many different things. So I see that higher level assumption of universality as the even greater danger.
Thank you for your last answer. Are there any other questions from our live viewers? All right. Then I will conclude by thanking you again, Mr. Bovenac, for this great interview. We will publish it on YouTube and send it to you in a few days. Thank you very
Okay.
much. Have a pleasant day for you, and a Merry Christmas
Well,
coming to
thank
me.
you. Same to you, and Merry Christmas.
Thank you.